He walked into the bank, proud first paycheck, fresh suit, everything earned. The teller smiled, until she saw his name, then whispered something under her breath. Security closed in. Within seconds, he was pinned against the glass. Forgery, they said, though the check came from his own employer. But as the manager reached for the shredder, he shouted, "That paper proves I built this branch." Why did they erase his name from the records? And who signed off on it? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Watch till the end. Then rate this story out of 10. Share in the comments below. Your feedback helps us bring you even better stories every single day. James Smith stood at the back of Maxwell Hall, clutching his small notebook and breathing shallow. The air inside the auditorium was cold, sterile, thick with anticipation, and every seat already taken. He was 10 years old, a child among a sea of gray-haired professors, doctoral candidates, elite students, yet here he was, standing rather than sitting, as had become his custom. He'd been told his whole life to sit down, be quiet, to not draw attention. But no one had ever asked whether he could. From where he stood, James watched the room. Dark wood paneling, rows of tiered seats rising like steps toward a distant ceiling. Bright lights aimed at a central whiteboard. The murmurs and rustling programs of the audience made him feel like a small ripple in an ocean of expectation. Every glance felt like a judgment. He told himself, just breathe, just observe. Don't let the nerves break you. On the stage, Professor Richard William paced in a crisp suit, adjusting his glasses, clearing his throat. He was older, distinguished, polished, the kind of man whose existence seemed built for rooms like this. As he began to speak, his voice resonated confidently. Mathematics, my friends, is a language few truly master. The applause that followed felt rehearsed, obligatory. James's heart pounded, sympathy and dread warring inside him. Professor William carried on, introducing the lecture's structure. He would walk through historical unsolved problems, then present a new conundrum, one he had been refining. He implied that at least today, elites would witness brilliance, but only among those qualified. He paused, eyes sweeping the audience, lingering on younger faces. James felt a brief chill, as if the professor's gaze scoured for anomalies. James shifted, the knot in his lower back reminding him he could not stay completely still for long. He'd adapted standing, subtly leaning, shifting weight, but every movement sent a needle of pain up his spine. He continued watching, fixated on the whiteboard before the exposition began. His mind buzzed with curiosity. What kind of new problem could be so advanced as to be called unsolvable on the spot? The professor cleared his throat and said, "Today I will present a problem that has defeated many minds not because it is impossible, but because conventional approaches fail." A slight smirk edged his lips, as though daring the audience to try. Murmurs scattered, faces leaned in. James swallowed hard. He'd encountered many unsolvable puzzles in library books, but never in a room like this. A hush fell across the hall, as the professor gestured toward a complex equation on the screen behind him. Loops, tensors, non-Euclidean geometry, symbols layered in unreadable density. The words, non-Euclidean differential mapping, were visible. A hush. Then he said, "No one here will solve this today, or even understand every part of it. But before I share my solution, I invite anyone brave enough to attempt it." Silence pressed in. The professionals shifted in their chairs. Some looked at neighbors as though asking, "Did you volunteer?" Others stared down at notes, uncomfortable with exposure. The room's silence roared louder than any applause could. James felt his breath hitch. His skin felt too tight, his heart too large for his small chest. He thought of Mrs. Nora, quietly urging him in class, her eyes lighting up when she glimpsed his notebook. He thought of his mother, working late in the hospital, barely sleeping, but always protective. He thought of the bruise across his back that even now lingered in subtle throb. He thought of Miss Winters, whose rage had nearly burned him into silence. Everything in him rebelled at the unsaid. "You don't belong here." Without permission from his body, his hand rose slowly, in a trembling gesture. Every millisecond, he expected someone to stop him, to shout no. The auditorium held its breath. Gasps flickered. The professor mid-sentence froze. All eyes turned toward the back row. James's voice, small, fragile, slipped into the microphone zone. "I'd like to try solving it." A murmur cracked like ice. The professor's face contorted surprise, irritation, disbelief all mingled. "Young man," he said, voice tight, This problem is hardly a puzzle for children. James swallowed. He heard a whisper from the audience. He's a child. He saw eyebrows arch, smiles of scorn flicker, but something deeper awakened in him. A refusal to shrink. He straightened, ignoring pain, ignoring doubt. Sir, I understand some parts. I'd still like to try. The room held still, like a drawn breath. The professor hesitated. He glanced at Dean Phillips, seated in front, whose calm eyes met his. He glanced at Mrs. Nora, standing at the side, a soft tension in her posture. Finally, he said, with a voice tight with authority, "Come forward." James stepped into the aisle, each footstep pounding in his ears. The tension seemed to coil around him. As he climbed the steps toward the stage, he realized the room had shifted. The audience no longer felt massive and distant, now they were watching him. His heart thundered. At the top of the stairs, the stage loomed bigger than he'd anticipated. The whiteboard, the projector, the cluster of professors watching him all loomed. He paused, catching his reflection in the glass panel of a lectern. A small boy in a crisp shirt that didn't quite belong, holding a marker as if it were a weapon. Professor William waited, expression unreadable. He handed James the marker, as though offering a gauntlet. "Show us your work," he said, his voice careful, constrained. A hush fell so deep it hurt. James lifted the marker, hand unsteady. He squared off with the equation before him. In that moment, time stretched. The sharp hum of lights, the distant shuffle of papers, the tremble of expectation all receded. There was only the board, the symbols, and the silent question in the air. Could he do it? And then, with a breath too soft to hear, James placed marker to board and began. As James's first line of reasoning appeared on the board, symbols beginning to unravel, relationships emerging, he froze. Because just then, someone in the audience gasped, and a single phone camera flashed. And James realized he was not the only one who had an unexpected piece of the solution waiting. The whiteboard in James Smith's fifth-grade classroom glowed faintly beneath the overhead lights. On it, Mrs. Nora had written a basic fractions problem, her voice warm and patient as she turned to address her class. "Can someone tell me what 3/5 of 25 is?" Several hands flew up. Eager voices whispered guesses. But James didn't raise his hand. He was standing at the back of the classroom again, the back wall pressing against his shoulder blades as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. His desk sat empty at the edge of the second row, a worn cushion placed gently on the seat, one he hadn't used in weeks. His fingers moved silently across his notebook, pencil scrawling invisible thunder. Into the pages. Equations, quick notes, glimpses of thought. While the class was just learning how to convert fractions, James was sketching the foundations of calculus he'd picked up from an old college library book. "James?" Mrs. Nora's voice floated through the room. He looked up, blinking. 15, he said, without thinking. A few heads turned. A murmur passed. "That's right." She smiled gently. "Can you explain how you got that?" "I multiplied 25 by 3, then divided by 5. Simple. Clean." Mrs. Nora's smile flickered into something deeper. She glanced at his notebook as she walked past his desk, empty again, and her heart squeezed. Most teachers might have seen a defiant child refusing to follow the rules, but she had seen something else. Something much more complicated. When James had first transferred into her class, he'd asked quietly if he could stand during lessons. "It helps my back," he'd said, eyes down, voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't pushed. Something in his tone, that fragile combination of fear and self-containment, made her say yes before she even thought to ask why. But she had noticed the way he flinched when someone walked too quickly behind him, the way his hand instinctively touched his lower back whenever the noise level rose, the way he avoided sitting, even during lunch. It was in late September when she saw the bruise. James had bent over to pick up a dropped pencil, and the hem of his shirt lifted slightly. The edge of the scar, a faint line, faint but too sharp to ignore, peeked out. She didn't mention it. Not then, but later that evening, she had pulled his file. The incident report was thin, a disciplinary misunderstanding from 4th grade. The name Miss Winters, listed as the reporting teacher. A written warning issued. No suspension. The word contusion appeared once in the school nurse's notes, filed quietly behind permission slips. Academic records. James never brought it up, not once. He stood at the back of the room like a boy balancing between shadows and spotlights, never quite sitting, never quite asking for anything. "Mrs. Nora had watched him closely in the weeks that followed. She watched him solve math puzzles far beyond his peers, watched him create his own, even. She watched him withdraw when praised too openly, watched him flinch when another student raised their voice. It was a puzzle of its own, and she was slowly putting the pieces together. "James," she asked one afternoon as the bell rang, "can I see your notebook?" He hesitated. His arms instinctively pulled it close to his chest. "No one's in trouble," she added gently. "I'm just curious." Still unsure, James walked slowly to her desk, placed it down, and stood silently as she flipped through the pages. Her eyes widened. It wasn't just neatness or precision. The level of work, trigonometric functions, differential equations, graph theory puzzles was not fifth-grade material. It wasn't even high school. "James, where did you learn this?" He shrugged. "The library. And YouTube." There was no boast in his voice. No pride. Just the sound of a boy stating a fact, like someone saying they preferred vanilla over chocolate. "Do you like math?" she asked. He paused. "It makes sense." She nodded slowly. "I think you might have a gift, James." He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. But his eyes flicked up for just a second, as if he'd heard those words once before in a dream and didn't quite believe them now. That night, Mrs. Nora emailed the principal. The next day, she stayed after school, watching James work through a complex proof she couldn't solve herself. Within 2 weeks, a community college professor was brought in to assess him. The professor left stunned. But not everyone was pleased. Some teachers murmured in the break room. "He doesn't even sit during class," one said. "What kind of message are we sending to the other students?" Others dismissed him as book smart, socially awkward, problematic. One even said, "Gifted or not, he still needs to follow rules like everyone else." James never heard these comments, but he felt them, in the sideways glances, the stiff smiles, the way some teachers stopped talking when he walked past. One day, he overheard a substitute mutter, "Kids like that just think they're better than the rest of us." That night, James didn't do math. He just lay on the floor of the small apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it meant when adults treated you like a problem instead of a person. At home, Amara Johnson, his mother, watched quietly. She'd noticed how he avoided chairs, how he curled slightly when the pain returned, how he whispered in his sleep. The anger she carried over what Miss Winters had done simmered just beneath the surface. But what cut deepest wasn't the injury. It was the system's response. The silence. The paperwork. The way the burden of proof had landed on a child's body. And still, James stood. Every day. Every lesson. He stood when it hurt. He stood when others stared. He stood when no one else did. Not because he wanted attention, but because it was the only way he could learn without pain. He had made standing his normal. The world hadn't made space for his pain, so he'd adjusted the world instead. And now, with Harvard on the horizon, that quiet resistance was about to be tested on the biggest stage of his young life. But as the trip approached, James received an anonymous note in his locker. It was written in clean, block letters, "Sit down at Harvard. Don't embarrass the school." His hands shook as he read it. The hallway blurred around him. Someone didn't want him to go. Or worse, didn't want him to be seen. And when he turned around, standing at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, watching him with a smirk, was the very teacher who had once whispered, "He thinks he's too good for us." James shoved the note in his pocket and walked away. But that night, lying awake in bed, he pulled it out again. And on the back, barely visible in faint pencil, was something chilling. "We all know what happened last year, and we know what you did." It was a Tuesday. The kind of warm spring day where the air outside was filled with the buzzing of lawnmowers, the smell of grass clippings, and the distant jingle of an ice cream truck echoing off brick. But inside, room 214 of Jefferson Elementary, the temperature was wrong. The AC had failed again, an aging system that had long since been deprioritized in the school's maintenance budget. The classroom air was heavy, sticky. 24 restless kids sat in old plastic chairs that creaked every time they shifted. And James Smith, age 9, sat straight-backed, eyes fixed on the whiteboard like it was the last thing tethering him to gravity. Miss Winters stood at the front, her voice flat, her tone clipped as she wrote across the board. She always wrote with too much force, like she was trying to bruise the board itself. "So, when we multiply these fractions," she was saying, "we get 3 minus 8 times 2/5 equals 6/40, which simplifies to 3/20. James whispered under his breath, frowning. What? Miss Winters snapped, spinning around. Her eyes darted toward him, sharp as glass. James hesitated, suddenly aware the room had gone too quiet. A few heads turned toward him. I think you said 6/40ths, but it should be 6/40ths simplified to 3/20ths, he said, his voice low. Miss Winters froze. Her face didn't show confusion. It didn't even show surprise. What it showed was insult. Excuse me, she said. James swallowed. I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just the math. A few students snickered nervously. They weren't laughing at James, not really. They were afraid. Everyone knew Miss Winters didn't like being corrected. She walked toward him slowly, ruler still in hand from earlier, when she'd been pointing at the board. James, she said, voice quiet now. Stand up. He obeyed. Confused, scared, still polite. She gestured toward the whiteboard. Tell the class what I did wrong. James shifted uncomfortably. You multiplied 3 minus eighths and 2/5ths, and said it equals 6/40ths. That's right. But you said 6/40ths simplifies to 6/20ths. That's not correct. 6/40ths simplifies to 3/20ths. Miss Winters stared at him. Her jaw clenched. Then, suddenly crack. The ruler came down hard on the edge of his desk. Not touching him. Not yet, but the noise was enough to silence every breath in the room. Are you trying to show off? She hissed. You think you're smarter than me? No, ma'am, James said quickly, hands trembling at his sides. I was just, face the class. He hesitated. I said, face the class. James turned, slowly. His cheeks flushed. The air prickled against his skin. Every eye was on him. And then it happened. Thwack. The ruler struck his lower back with a sharp, stinging force that knocked the wind out of him. It wasn't just the pain, though, that was enough to make his knees wobble. It was the humiliation. No one said a word. Miss Winters leaned in, low enough that only the front row could hear. That's for disrupting my class and undermining my authority. James returned to his seat in silence, back burning, mind reeling. Miss Winters went on as if nothing happened, as if the moment had vanished. But for James, the sound of that ruler cutting the air would never leave. That evening, Amara Johnson came home from a long nursing shift and found her son lying on the floor, homework scattered in front of him. Baby, why? Are you on the floor? She asked gently. My back hurts, he replied. Something in his voice made her stop. When she examined him, her hands turned cold. A red welt stretched across his lower back, angry and raw. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply said, get your coat. They went to the ER. The doctor confirmed what she feared. Deep bruising. Muscle trauma. He prescribed rest, pain medication, and limited sitting. That night, Amara typed up a statement for the school. She attached the medical records, added timestamps, and made 3 copies. The next morning, she marched into Principal Davis's office. But she didn't find a wall of support. She found hesitation, excuses, doubt. James may have misinterpreted the teacher's intentions, the principal said. Her intentions left a bruise across my child's back, Amara replied icily. We'll investigate thoroughly, he said. 2 weeks later, Miss Winters was still teaching. No suspension, no leave, no public apology. She received a formal written warning, Davis finally told her. Given her 20 years of service, and no prior incidents, we believe this is an appropriate response. You believe, Amara said, that hitting a black boy with a ruler for correcting a math mistake deserves a warning? There were no witnesses who confirmed James's account. There were 24 students in that room, Amara growled. Yes, Davis said, but none have come forward. What neither Amara nor James knew was that Miss Winters had made her own rounds. Quiet threats, veiled warnings. If anyone lies about me, she said to the class the next day, I will find out. Fear had locked every mouth. James returned to school the next week, but he never sat in Miss Winters' class again. She'd been reassigned. Yet the wound remained. Not just in his back, but in the spaces that were supposed to be safe. He had been taught, at 9 years old, that correcting an adult, especially one who didn't expect brilliance to come from a boy like him, could cost you more than respect. It could cost you protection. And even now, a year later, standing in the hallway, with that new note in his hand, we all know what happened last year, and we know what you did. It all came rushing back. He turned, expecting shadows. But what he saw chilled him more. There, just a few feet away, stood Miss Winters. Not fired, Not gone. She was smiling. And beside her, laughing softly, whispering, was a new teacher James had never seen before. A man with cold eyes and a Harvard alumni pin on his lanyard. He looked right at James and said, "Didn't expect to see you standing again." The morning sun filtered softly through the windows of room 307, casting warm, golden slants across the rows of fifth-grade desks. Dust particles danced in the light, but the classroom itself was still quiet, except for the gentle scratch of pencils and the occasional shuffle of sneakers on tile. At the back of the room, James Smith stood silently beside his desk, not out of defiance but out of necessity. Mrs. Nora had grown used to it. Unlike the other teachers James had encountered, she hadn't tried to force him into a chair or asked him twice why he preferred to stand. She'd seen it in his eyes the first week he joined her class, something brittle and tightly controlled. A boy who had learned not to explain himself unless cornered. "James, do you want to sit?" she'd asked casually the first day, her tone more invitation than instruction. He'd shaken his head. "It hurts when I sit too long." That was all he said, and that was all she needed. Now, 2 months into the school year, James had become a quiet fixture at the back of her room, always upright, always scribbling in that thick black notebook he never let anyone touch. On this particular Tuesday, the class was working on a decimals worksheet. Nothing advanced, just converting between tenths and hundredths. The kind of thing most students wrestled with or got bored of after a few minutes. But Mrs. Nora noticed James wasn't doing the worksheet. His pencil was moving too fast, too fluid, like his hand was chasing thoughts before they could disappear. She moved gently between desks, peeking at student work, offering occasional praise or direction. When she finally reached James, she stood beside him without saying a word. His eyes were laser-focused. His lips moved in barely audible whispers. "Negative slope. Carry the one. Find the limit." "James," she said softly. He jumped, startled, nearly dropping his pencil. "Sorry," he mumbled. "I wasn't." "You weren't off task," she interrupted gently. "I just noticed you weren't working on the decimal sheet. What are you working on instead?" He hesitated. His body leaned slightly toward the notebook, protective. "Can I see?" she asked. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, James handed it over, his eyes darting between her and the rest of the room. Mrs. Nora opened the cover and flipped to the most recent page. Her brows lifted. On the page was a hand-drawn Cartesian plane, 3 lines intersecting with clear labeled coordinates. Below it, a set of polynomial expressions neatly solved. Then on the next page, a calculus derivative notation she hadn't seen since college. She flipped further, past pages filled with proofs, abstract shapes, and advanced equations. This wasn't accelerated. It wasn't even high school. This was college-level mathematics. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The library," James replied. "And YouTube." He said it as if it were nothing. As if unlocking advanced mathematical theory from a public library book was something any kid with a library card could do. Mrs. Nora stared at the notebook for another moment, then closed it gently and handed it back. "James," she said, "would you mind staying after class for just 5 minutes?" He nodded, quietly alarmed. "Am I in trouble?" "No," she said, her voice filled with something closer to wonder. "You're not in trouble. You might be something else entirely." The bell rang. Students packed up and filed out. A few waved goodbye to Mrs. Nora. A girl named Talia stopped to whisper, "He never does the real assignments, you know." Mrs. Nora only smiled. And yet, somehow, he always understands the real lesson. When the room finally emptied, she closed the door and turned back to James. He was still standing, still gripping his notebook like a shield. "Do you know what you're doing in that book?" she asked gently. "I think so." "Do you know that what you're doing is years ahead of your grade?" He looked down. "Most people don't like it when I say that." "I'm not most people." James glanced up cautiously. She sat down across from him. "How long have you been doing this kind of math?" "Since I was 7, he said. "I liked patterns. Numbers don't argue. They just are." There was something heartbreaking in that explanation. "Has anyone ever tested you for a gifted program?" she asked. He shook his head. "The school said I didn't qualify last year." Her heart clenched. "Why not?" "They said I didn't work well with others. That I didn't follow directions." The words weren't bitter. Just hollow. Rehearsed. Mrs. Nora leaned back in her chair. She thought of the staff meetings, the casual comments. "That boy's always standing. Won't follow classroom protocol. He's smart, sure, but kind of stubborn. She thought about the way other teachers described him, like he was a puzzle too inconvenient to solve. And suddenly she realized James hadn't slipped through the cracks. He'd been pushed. Would it be okay if I talked to the principal about your work? She asked carefully. James froze. I'm not in trouble, James, she said gently. You might be the most brilliant math mind I've ever seen. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm trying to make sure someone sees you. He blinked, unsure whether to believe her. But slowly, he nodded. That afternoon, Mrs. Nora walked into the faculty lounge, gripping James's notebook like a sacred text. She found Principal Davis stirring powdered creamer into coffee and launched into the story before he could ask why she looked so rattled. I need you to see this, she said, placing the notebook on the table between them. Principal Davis flipped through it skeptically. Then he flipped again. And again. These are college-level equations, he muttered. Who did this? James Smith. The fifth grader who stands? Yes, that one. There was a long silence. Then the principal said, we need to bring someone in. And just like that, the wheels began to turn. But later that night, as Mrs. Nora lay awake replaying the day, her phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. No name. Just one sentence. Don't make this boy a spectacle. Some math problems aren't meant to be solved. And attached was a photo of James's notebook. A photo she had never taken. By the time the Harvard letter arrived, the late autumn chill had crept into everything: desks, windows, even the hallways. The building creaked more than usual. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead like nerves on edge. Principal Davis sat in his office, envelope in hand, flipping it over again and again like it was some kind of trick. The crimson seal on the front caught the light. Harvard University, Department of Mathematics. The email had come earlier that morning, the physical letter followed by courier. Subject: invitation to participate in the National Mathematical Talent Outreach Program. 12 schools had been selected. Jefferson Elementary, an under-resourced school, in a district better known for budget cuts than excellence, was somehow one of them. Davis had read the line 3 times. We invite your top mathematical minds from grades 5-8 to attend a live lecture and challenge demonstration at Harvard University's campus. Faculty will present complex, unsolved problems, and students will be encouraged to ask questions, observe high-level methodology, and in exceptional cases, engage. He exhaled slowly. Exceptional cases. That phrase clung to him like static. Across the building, Mrs. Nora stood at the window of her classroom, watching clouds drift low over the trees. She didn't know about the letter yet, not officially, but something was about to change. She felt it. The door to her classroom opened softly, and James stepped in early, as usual. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, his posture tall, if guarded. Good morning, James, she said. He nodded. Hi. You okay? He hesitated. Can I stand by the window for a minute before class starts? Of course. He walked past the rows of empty desks and leaned gently against the ledge, watching the clouds too. I used to think math was like clouds, he said suddenly. Big and floating and everywhere. But really it's more like the wind. You don't always see it, but it moves everything. Mrs. Nora blinked. That's beautiful. James shrugged. It's just true. By lunch, the letter had made its rounds. Davis handed it to her during break, and she read it with a stunned silence. Then she smiled. This is James, she said, without even a moment of hesitation. He's the one. We'll need to nominate a few 8th graders, Davis replied carefully. The program mentions grades 5-8, but preference will be given to older students. With all due respect, she replied. Those 8th graders aren't doing second-year calculus in the back of the room on notebook paper. James is. Davis raised an eyebrow. There may be some concerns. She leaned forward. Because he stands? Because he doesn't follow certain norms. And this is Harvard. It's a high-pressure academic space. Mrs. Nora's voice dropped. If Harvard's only interested in how someone sits, not how they think, then maybe we don't belong there anyway. There was a long pause. I'll include his name, Davis finally said. But I expect pushback. From faculty, possibly from parents. She nodded, jaw tight. Then we push back harder. The faculty meeting later that week was exactly what Davis predicted. 3 teachers raised objections. He doesn't follow classroom structure. He stands during lessons, and some students find it distracting. Is it fair to promote a student who won't even sit at his desk? Mrs. Nora tried to contain her fury. He stands because he's injured, she said, louder than she intended. Because your colleagues struck him in class and the school did nothing. The room fell still. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. A few stared blankly at their papers. Only one Miss Lee from the art department spoke. I've seen his work, she said. It's something else. The kind of mind that doesn't come around often. We'd be fools to not send him. Davis nodded slowly. He'll go. At home, James sat on the floor with his knees tucked to his chest. A library copy of Understanding Higher Dimensions spread open before him. Amara stepped into the room, still in her hospital scrubs. She looked tired, but when she saw the envelope on the coffee table, she paused. What's that? James glanced up. From school. I think it's about a trip. She picked it up, opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the letter. Then she sank onto the couch, hand over her mouth. They want to take you to Harvard. James blinked. Harvard? Harvard, she repeated, voice catching. Baby, they think you're one of the best math students in the country. He was silent for a long moment. Do they know I stand? He asked quietly. Amara's heart twisted. Yes, she said. And you're going anyway. That night, she got a call from Davis. There's been a small development, he said. What kind of development? Technically, we need a medical note to confirm his need to stand. Harvard is asking for standard accommodations paperwork. They want it on record. Of course, she said. That's not a problem. Just prepare yourself. There may be scrutiny. Amara's voice sharpened. From whom? But Davis didn't answer. The next morning, an anonymous note appeared in James's cubby. No name. Just 5 words. Try sitting at Harvard. Once. Mrs. Nora found it during cleanup. James hadn't said anything. He'd simply folded it and tucked it into his math book. But his eyes that day were a little darker, his back a little stiffer. She held the note in her hands, and for the first time in her career, she felt something she hadn't felt in a classroom before. Rage. And yet, amid the whispering teachers and murmuring parents and passive-aggressive hallway glances, one thing remained unshaken. James was going. He stood in the hallway the day before the trip, dressed in his cleanest shirt, the one Mrs. Nora had bought quietly during a field trip after noticing the fraying collar of his usual white one. And then something strange happened. A teacher, one who had loudly objected to James's inclusion, walked past him, gave a stiff smile, and said, "Don't make us regret this." James nodded politely, but something in his chest cracked. And that night, as Amara packed James's small bag, she opened the front pocket to insert his pain medication and found a torn piece of paper someone had slipped inside. A message written in thick black ink. Harvard isn't for you. Underlined. 3 times. The conference room at Jefferson Elementary smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and stale coffee. It was a small, beige space with a long table that had seen better days, surrounded by mismatched chairs and too many opinions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects too stubborn to die. James sat beside his mother, Amara, his feet not quite reaching the floor. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, squeezing themselves until the knuckles turned white. Across the table sat Principal Davis, 2 district representatives, a Harvard program liaison via Zoom on a grainy laptop screen, and 3 faculty members, none of whom had smiled since he walked in. "Thank you all for coming," Davis began, adjusting his tie, though no one was looking at him. "As you know, we've been offered an incredible opportunity." "We're not questioning the opportunity," interrupted Mr. Carver, a math coach with the air of someone who thought everything was a TED Talk he should be leading. "We're questioning preparedness. Harvard isn't a field trip to the zoo." "I don't believe anyone's suggesting it is," said Mrs. Nora, seated on James's other side. Her tone was calm, but there was iron underneath it. "I just think we need to discuss the logistics," said Miss Peterson, the 5th grade team lead. "Particularly, James's behavior in class." "Behavior?" Amara said, slowly turning toward her. "He's 9. What behavior?" Miss Peterson cleared her throat. "Well, he doesn't sit. He doesn't participate in group activities. He often chooses his own assignments. He stands," Amara repeated, "because he's in pain. Which is understandable, of course. But the concern is how that will translate in a prestigious academic environment. Harvard professors may view it as disruptive." James stared at the table, his ears burning. His mind fixated on the word disruptive, like a fire alarm or a coughing fit. Not like a person, not like a child. The woman from Harvard, Dr. Eileen Marks, unmuted herself. The screen flickered as she leaned closer. Can someone clarify for me? She asked. What accommodations have already been made for James? Mrs. Nora spoke up. We allow him to stand during lessons. He's also been excused from PE and long writing sessions. He uses an ergonomic cushion when needed. His performance hasn't suffered, in fact. It's excelled. He doesn't just excel, she added. He builds equations from patterns he's never been taught. He reverse-engineered a recursive proof from a college textbook last month. And we appreciate that, Miss Peterson said, glancing at Davis. But Harvard is. Harvard. The standards are rigorous. What if a professor asks him to sit, and he refuses? What if he makes them uncomfortable? Amara leaned forward now. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. You're worried about his posture making people uncomfortable, she said, low and steady. Let me tell you what made me uncomfortable. The room fell silent. When my son came home last year with a bruise across his lower back from a teacher who couldn't handle being corrected in front of her class, no one in this school seemed too concerned about discomfort then. You know what your investigation gave us? A warning. A warning for the teacher. She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. And now you're worried that James standing to avoid pain might be a distraction for Harvard professors? Miss Peterson blinked. Mr. Carver coughed. No one responded. Amara turned to Dr. Marks. My son isn't being difficult. He's being resilient. He's standing in a world that told him to sit down and take the hit. He stood up in pain, in silence, and he kept learning anyway. Doctor, Marks nodded slowly. We have no intention of excluding any student from medical accommodations, she said firmly. If documentation is provided, James is cleared to stand during the session. Mrs. Nora relaxed slightly, but Davis still looked hesitant. What about optics? He asked. What message does it send if our only representative spends the lecture standing at the back of the room? There was a beat of silence. Then Amara smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile forged under pressure, built for war. It sends the message, she said, that pain doesn't disqualify brilliance. After the meeting, James and his mother walked down the empty hallway together. Fluorescent lights buzzed above them like anxious bees. His backpack felt heavier than usual. I shouldn't have said anything last year, he murmured. Then none of this stop, Amara said, crouching down in front of him. What happened to you wasn't your fault. What's happening now is their way of pretending they didn't fail you. James looked at her. What if someone at Harvard says something? About me standing? She smoothed his collar. Then you look them in the eye, and you say, I'm still learning. Are you? He cracked a tiny smile. That sounds like something you'd say. I hope it does. That night, James sat on his bed, flipping through pages of his notebook. He wasn't working through any equations. He was rereading old ones, checking his own logic like a ritual, like armor. The more he reviewed, the more real Harvard began to feel. But when he reached for his backpack to pack for the trip, he noticed something wedged deep in the bottom seam. A note. It was typed this time. Anonymous. You'll be on camera. Everyone will be watching. One wrong move, and they'll remember you, not your math. He froze. There was no signature, no handwriting, just cold, clinical text. He didn't tell his mother. Not yet. Not because he was hiding it, but because some part of him knew. The threat wasn't about stopping him. It was about shrinking him. And if he said it out loud, maybe it would work. He folded the note and slid it under his mattress. Then he stood up, no cushion, no chair, and began solving the first problem in his notebook again, from scratch. If they were going to watch, then he would make sure they had something worth watching. The next morning, as the bus rolled into the Harvard campus, a security officer stepped aboard before the students could exit. He looked directly at James and said, I need to see your name badge. James held it up. The officer stared, then muttered, So you're the one, and walked off without another word. The oak-paneled faculty chamber of Harvard's Pierce Hall was silent, save for the clink of a porcelain cup against a saucer. Professor Richard William, chair of the Department of Mathematical Theory, set his tea down with the kind of precision that reflected his belief in order academic, social, historical. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, eyes narrowed at the projection screen, displaying the day's schedule for the National Mathematical Talent Outreach Program. Across from him, Dean Phillips scrolled through his tablet, calm but firm. He had learned long ago that confronting Professor William directly was like running headfirst into a brick wall, better to wear him down with slow, methodical reasoning. I'm not questioning the value of outreach, Professor William said. Finally. But the purpose of this event was to engage with mathematically gifted students who have already demonstrated excellence within traditional systems. Inviting a Title I elementary school with no STEM reputation, frankly, it's confusing. Dean Phillips didn't look up. You mean it's unfamiliar? I mean it's unprecedented, William replied. We're opening our doors to fifth graders from underperforming districts, many of whom statistically won't even test into honors algebra by ninth grade. A tense beat of silence. Dean Phillips looked up now. Statistics don't predict individual brilliance, Richard. You of all people should know that. I've seen minds in night school that rivaled Rhodes Scholars. They just didn't look the part. I'm not making this about appearance, William said too quickly. I'm talking about preparedness, structure, rigor. No, the dean said quietly. You're talking about tradition. The professor straightened. I'm talking about excellence. Philip stood and walked to the window. Outside, buses were beginning to unload. Students of all shapes, shades, and accents spilled out into the crimson-lined courtyard. Tradition's given us much, the dean said. But it's also blinded us. You think the next Ramanujan is going to arrive wearing a bow tie and reciting Euclid in Latin? William smirked. Would be refreshing, would be predictable, Phillips countered. Which is exactly why we miss the real ones. Meanwhile, outside, James Smith stood just beyond the wrought iron gates of Harvard Yard, staring at the courtyard like it was another world. Red bricks, ivy-covered walls, students with badges, tablets, laughter. He gripped the straps of his backpack. Beside him, Mrs. Nora adjusted her scarf. It's just a place, she said, reading his mind. It's not smarter than you. It's just older. James didn't respond, but he gave her a tiny nod. In his pocket was the anonymous note from the night before, the one warning him that one wrong move would define everything. He hadn't shown it to anyone. Not because he was afraid, though he was, but because he needed to prove, even if just to himself, that he didn't need saving. Let's go, he whispered, and stepped onto the campus like it was a tightrope. Inside Pierce Hall, the auditorium buzzed with hushed excitement. Rows of hand-selected students from elite private academies, high-performing charter schools, and 2 magnet middle schools filed in. Jefferson Elementary was seated near the back. Some of the other students turned to glance. A few smiled. Most didn't. James stood quietly, notebook in hand, refusing the offered chair. A boy in a pressed uniform 2 rows up whispered to his friend, not softly enough. Why's that kid standing? Is he security or something? James heard it. Let it wash over him. Focused on the whiteboard. At the front, Professor William entered, flanked by 2 graduate assistants. He didn't glance toward the back rows. Welcome, he began, to Harvard University. The room quieted instantly. His presence had gravity. You are here, he continued, not because of quotas or politics or tokenism. You are here because math is a language few speak well and fewer still, fluently. James narrowed his eyes. There was something pointed in that phrasing. Professor William moved to the board and began writing a theorem complex, layered, designed to intimidate more than educate. The problem I'll present today is unsolved. Not impossible, but unsolved. And no, I don't expect anyone here to solve it. He let the silence linger. A hum of pressure filled the room. I expect you, he continued, to watch, listen, and understand why brilliance requires discipline and tradition. From the side, Dean Phillips folded his arms, eyes tracking the professor like a chess opponent. James took out his pencil. And that's when something unexpected happened. Professor William glanced up, scanning the crowd. His eyes flicked past rows of uniforms, stopping just barely on the boy standing in the back. A subtle pause. Then he turned back to the board. Let's begin. In the faculty chamber, minutes later, a grad assistant returned with a whisper to Professor William during a break in the presentation. That student from Jefferson Elementary, James Smith. He's been working through the problem in his notebook. William stiffened. Already? Yes, sir. He's making some headway. Quietly. No disruption. But he's standing. Refusing the seat. The professor exhaled sharply through his nose. Then it is a disruption. Whether he realizes it or not. Dean Phillips, overhearing, leaned in. Or maybe it's a signal that he's not afraid to take up space the system tried to erase him from. I'll handle it, William muttered. Back in the auditorium, as Professor William resumed the lecture, he paused mid-sentence. Then, without warning, he said, Young man in the back, if you think you've made progress on the problem, come up here and show us. James looked up. The entire room turned to stare. One student whispered, "Wait him?" And James stepped forward. But at that exact moment, a teacher from another school leaned toward the Harvard program coordinator and said under her breath, "Are we really letting him near the board?" The whiteboard loomed like a wall, towering, sterile, and infinite in its silence. As James approached, the room seemed to shrink behind him. Rows of seats faded into shadows. Student faces became a blur of judgment and disbelief. Every step felt like a note in a silent symphony he hadn't asked to conduct. Professor William uncapped a fresh black marker, the smell sharp and clinical. "This," he said, tapping the board once, "is a problem adapted from the Clay Mathematics Institute, a variation of the Navier-Stokes existence and smoothness problem modified to test conceptual abstraction." He turned to the room. "In plain terms, this is not meant to be solved. Not here. Not today. And certainly not by anyone in this room." The words hit the air like stone. James stopped just short of the board. He stood still. The marker hadn't been offered to him. Professor William gave him a long look. "Well?" he said. "You asked to be seen. Now show us something." There was no malice in his tone, but there was a chill, the cold professionalism of a man who believed deeply in hierarchy, in pedigree, in earned presence. James didn't reach for the marker. Instead, he took out his notebook and flipped it to a page already half filled with symbols and notes written sideways in the margins. His pencil began to move before he fully registered why. Muscle memory, overriding doubt. The board displayed a series of partial differential equations, nested integrals, vector fields, and initial conditions framed with deliberate complexity. It wasn't just math, it was a labyrinth, a test within a trap. James didn't flinch. His pencil scratched softly. "Assume incompressibility, curl of V equals 0. Apply divergence theorem." Professor William watched him, arms crossed. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice cool. James looked up. Reframing, Professor William raised a brow. "You think this is a game of tricks?" James shook his head. "It's not tricks, it's structure. You said the problem was unsolved. That doesn't mean it's unreadable." A few students murmured. On the side, Dean Phillips sat up straighter. Professor William stepped back. "Then read it," he said. "Let's hear the translation." James exhaled. He approached the board and finally picked up the marker. The cap clicked off like a bullet casing. He began writing in the lower corner, beneath the original equations, where there was just enough room. "Start with the assumption of laminar flow," he said aloud. "Simplify the tensor notation to isolate shear stress. From here, stop," William said suddenly. James froze. The professor moved toward him, slowly. "Where did you learn tensor notation?" "The library," James replied. William's face remained blank. "Which book?" "Fetter and Waleka. Also some chapters in Mathematics of Classical Physics by Marsden." A beat. William turned back to the board, then back to James. "You're standing there with a pencil and a backpack full of library books, attempting to deconstruct a Millennium Prize problem." James didn't answer. His hand gripped the marker a little tighter. "And you think," William added, "that this room is the right place for that?" Something inside, James snapped. Not a loud break, but a thread, pulled taut for too long, finally fraying. "I don't know what room is," he said, "but this is the only one that let me in." That silence was different. This one rippled. Dean Phillips leaned forward. "James, keep going." James nodded, turned back to the board. He continued writing, annotating each line as he spoke, tracing logic through chaos like a violinist playing a melody no one else had rehearsed. "The vector field here is unstable under classic assumptions," he said. "But if you redefine the boundary conditions," Professor William took a sharp step forward. "You're making dangerous leaps." "I'm making necessary ones," James countered. A girl in the third row began filming. No one stopped her. A boy from one of the elite charter schools leaned forward, muttering, "Holy, he's not wrong." James filled the lower half of the board in 8 minutes. By the time he capped the marker, his hand was shaking. He stepped back. The room was dead still. Professor William approached the board slowly, eyes scanning the work. Not for mistakes, but for arrogance. Missteps. Signs of a bluff. Instead, he found clarity. Maybe not a full solution, but a shift in the framework. A direction no one in the room had considered. "This," he said finally, "is unconventional, messy, unverified. James met his gaze. So was gravity. Until someone asked why things fall. William stared at him. Do you even know what it means to be wrong in this building? James held his ground. Do you? A ripple. Again. Behind them, the grad assistant whispered to another. He's not solving the problem. He's reshaping it. And then unexpectedly Professor William turned to Dean Phillips. I want a copy of this work, he said. Dean Phillips stood. We'll scan his notebook. Then he looked at James. If that's all right with you. James nodded. Professor William hesitated. Why do you stand, James? The question was genuine this time. No test. No trap. James looked at the rows of students. At his teacher, sitting breathless in the back. At his own trembling fingers. Because sitting was the first thing they tried to take from me. And the room, Harvard, tradition, legacy, doubt, all of it paused. As the crowd began to stir, and the murmurs turned to scattered applause, the back door opened quietly. A woman in a sharp gray blazer stepped in. She didn't take a seat. She stood, arms folded, and stared directly at James. Professor William noticed her. His face changed. Subtly, not fear but awareness. Dean Phillips frowned. Why is she here? He muttered. And James, though he didn't know her yet, felt it in his gut. The problem on the board wasn't the only test. James stood in the back of the Harvard lecture hall, his legs shifting ever so slightly, as if recalibrating under the weight of expectation. The lecture had progressed further than he dared hope. Professor Williams' voice echoed across the auditorium. Dense, precise, authoritative. Yet James was halfway losing it not by heart, but by body. His lower back throbbed, a sharp edge of agony reminding him of past strikes, of that blunt rubber ruler, of every time he had to adapt to be allowed to exist. The professor paused mid-exposition, turning to trace a complex integral on the screen. An awkward ripple ran through the audience. Students stiffening, chairs creaking, the hum of air conditioning turned too loud in sudden silence. I want to address something, William said, pivoting in his lectern. His eyes flicked toward the back row, too, where James stood thin and elongated. The air in the hall seemed to shrink. Sir, William's voice rose, slicing through the hush. This is a formal university lecture, not a casual demonstration. Standing is disruptive. If you cannot sit, then you must exit. A gasp. Chairs shifted. All eyes turned. James's breath caught. The hum of tension grew thick, like compressed air in lungs. James opened his mouth. Before he could speak, Mrs. Nora leapt from her seat near the side aisle, rising. She walked forward with gentle authority, her steps measured but her presence commanding. She called out, Professor William James has prior approval to stand as an accommodation. A murmur erupted. William's expression crystallized surprise, irritation, calculation. Approval? He repeated. From whom? Show it to me. Dean Phillips, sitting front center, stood too, his presence sharp and authoritative. He pointed at the program coordinator at his side. The coordinator tapped a folder on his desk. Yes, we have documentation, he said. Medical verification submitted. Harvard cleared it under ADA policy. William's lips pursed. He glanced at the dean, then at James. He seemed to weigh something invisible. James glanced at Mrs. Nora. Her face was firm, unyielding. He felt her behind him. A pillar of advocacy. William's voice, when he spoke, was tight. Very well, you may remain standing, but I will not tolerate you speaking out of turn. You stay silent unless spoken to. James nodded, though the weight behind his nod was much heavier than just assent. William turned back to the whiteboard and resumed. As I was saying, the curl of the vector field under the given boundary conditions yields no closed loops. He began another slide, the symbols spinning into view behind him. James held his breath. Each shift of his weight was a negotiation with his nerves, his spine, his fear. A student near the front raised a tentative hand. William allowed it. The student asked for clarification. William responded crisply, then resumed the path. 20 minutes passed. The complexity deepened. Differential forms, topological mapping, non-linear perturbations. For the audience, many struggled. For James, the mental pulse raced. Hidden connections surfaced. His heartbeat matched the rhythms of solution. But behind the calm veneer, pain coiled. His legs threatened to buckle. His vision flickered at the edges. Suddenly, William stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head sharply. Silence. His eyes narrowed. James, he said, his voice low but projected. If you've made progress on that segment you sketched earlier, You may come forth and present it." The room inhaled. Students murmured. Fellow attendees sat up straighter, surprised. James's heart pounded. The pain flared. But he took a tentative step forward. Each step amplified the hush. He made his way down the aisle, the board looming, the audience parting. The marker James had set aside glinted under stage lights. He reached the front. William, arms folded, watched him. "Your turn," James swallowed. He touched his lower back briefly, wincing but refused to collapse. He picked up the marker. The room held as he turned to the board. He paused. The equation behind him was partially mid-derivation from William's own slide. James considered the path. He referenced his own margin notes. He began writing. A reparameterization of boundary conditions. A constraint he'd found in the margins. A subtle linearization that might simplify a nonlinear term. Voices muttered. Even professors leaned forward. The air crackled. In that moment, Professor Williams' rigid mask flickered. Uncertainty passed across his features. He watched James's hand. Then, unexpectedly, the back door of the auditorium clicked open. A security guard slipped in, eyes sweeping the room. All attention flickered. William paused mid-step. James froze. Mid-equation. The guard approached silently toward the stage. Mrs. Nora rose as though to object. Dean Phillips looked displeased. The guard whispered something in William's ear. William's face drained. The guard motioned subtly at James. The room felt the shift like gravity pulling sideways. William cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, attempting authority, "we must pause briefly due to a security matter." The audience jolted. He stepped off stage toward the guard. James's writing hung unfinished on the board. The silence shrank around him. The guard's presence framed by the stage lights was sudden. His gaze didn't flick to any student. He targeted James's stance. James swallowed hard, marker in hand, shoulder trembling. Every eye in the room fell back toward him. Students, professors, guests. The tension roared louder than applause. He looked at William, then the guard, then Dean Phillips. His mind spun. As Professor William approached the guard's earpiece crackled. He looked at William, then at James. He said, "Bring me his notebook." James's blood went cold. The board, the marker, the audience all held their breath. A hush fell over Maxwell Hall, the kind of hush that makes even the walls listen. All chatter, shifting feet, restless taps of phones ceased. The lecture paused, mid-breath. Professor William, caught between his prepared delivery and the sudden stillness, froze. Only one thing moved. James's hand, raised slowly into the air. He stood at the back, half hidden in shadow, yet his gesture stretched across the auditorium like a signal. The marker he had held earlier now rested forgotten at his side. In his eyes, a fierce, quiet, "I am here." William's lips parted. "Young man," he said, his voice tight. The audience leaned forward. "Do you have a question about the problem?" James's breath came shallow. He cleared his throat. The air crackled. "No, sir." He raised, his voice, louder now. "I'd like to try solving it." Gasps echoed. Some students blinked. Professors shifted. Women swapped surprised glances. William's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation and incredulity. He glanced to Dean Phillips, whose face was an impassive mask, but whose eyes glowed with interest. "Do you understand what you're asking?" William asked, his tone carefully controlled. "This is a problem built to resist solutions in public. It's a demonstration of limits, not attempts." James swallowed. His back pinched in pain, a reminder that made every breath a choice, but he stood firm. "I understand some parts," he said. "Not all, but enough to try." William's jaw tightened. He looked at the board, where the problem still loomed like a fortress. He bit his lip. He turned to the audience. "Is this appropriate?" he asked. Silence pressed, heavy. Dean Phillips stood, voice clear. "He's invited. He's here. If no one else will volunteer, why silence will be worse than attempt." William's eyes flicked to James. The auditorium held its breath. Finally, William nodded, sharply. He motioned to the board. "Then come forward." The audience murmured. Some chairs scraped. James stepped forward, each footstep echoing. He felt every gaze, their weight like gravity. He reached the whiteboard. The air smelled faintly of marker dust and high expectations. He touched the board lightly and drew a small outline of what he planned to do: a reparameterization, a shifting of variables he glimpsed earlier in his notebook. Some in the crowd whispered, "He's bold. He's foolish. He's brave." Professor William turned to face him. "Proceed." His voice was low, but every corner of the auditorium heard. James's pencil trembled for a second, but then his hand found a rhythm. He began writing. He started with the boundary conditions, rewriting the nested integral. He sketched a small mapping on the side, transform domain to compact manifold. He spoke each move softly, so that his words rippled outward. This term, he said, pointing to a coefficient, can be simplified by a dimension extension rather than reducing. We expand the domain and consider a new vector base. The divergence becomes linear under new constraints. Heads tilted. Professor Williams' body stiffened. He watched the lines as they appeared, like filaments stretching out. Some of the more advanced students murmured among themselves. Others just stared, stunned. James continued, voice steady. Then we linearize the perturbation, assuming the torsion term is small relative to curvature. That helps isolate the residual and collapse the nonlinear coupling. He paused, cheeks flushed, hands steadying. The board behind him glowed under stage lights. William walked forward slowly, scanning James's work. His face was unreadable. The audience leaned forward. Everything was happening in the tension between lines of math and silence. James added the final substitution. He wrote the last piece. He closed. He turned, breathing hard. The board bore something new. A coherent, if partial, path among chaos. William exhaled. The silence held. Then a single professor stood older, white-haired, his face lit by dawning fascination. That is impressive, he murmured. One by one, applause spread. Quiet at first, then louder. The auditorium erupted, soft clapping, then real, wholehearted applause. James leaned against the board, closing his eyes for a second, overwhelmed. His back throbbed like a bell tolling, but his heart soared. He looked at William. The professor's mask was gone now, replaced by a flicker of something else. Respect, dread, recognition. From the side row, Dean Phillips rose and approached the stage. She placed a hand gently on James's shoulder. William cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Smith. James exhaled, relieved, triumphant, vulnerable. But then before, cheers could drown the moment the back door creaked. The security guard from earlier reappeared, standing rigid in the doorway. He carried James's notebook in a crisp manila envelope. The auditorium quieted instantly. The guard walked to the front, placed the envelope on a table by the whiteboard. The flap was open. Pages peeked out. He said, voice low, "We have your work." James's stomach dropped. William's eyes darted. Phillips's jaw tensed. All together, the moment fractured. James stared at the notebook on the table between them. And then a page slipped out and fell onto the floor, flipping open to a hidden margin note that no one had seen before, one written in a handwriting not his own. And it read, "You weren't supposed to show this yet." What is that note? James's shoes made soft echoes on the polished floor as he walked to the front, the path between seats feeling unnaturally long. Each step stung in his back, a reminder that slow motion was sometimes the only kind real pain allowed. The auditorium's ambient hum receded into silence. All attention drew to him like a magnet. He paused at the whiteboard. The marker was on its tray. He extended a trembling hand and picked it up. The cap clicked off sharply. The room inhaled. He planted his feet, swallowed, and faced the equation behind him. It loomed, proud and complex, a wall of symbols. Professor Williams stood at the side, arms crossed, watching. Dean Phillips leaned forward in his seat. The audience sat taut. Mrs. Nora's face was lit by spotlights, a quiet anchor in the storm of expectation. James drew a deep breath and began. First, he broke the monster down. Identify which terms were linear, which were nonlinear. Flag the coupling constants. He drew arrows, restructured the syntax, subscripted and superscripted as he went. Each stroke was deliberate, cautious, even precious. As he decomposed the equation, his hand trembled, not just from nerves, but from pain. He paused briefly, pressing a palm to his lower back, a damp sheen of sweat on his brow, but he steadied himself and resumed. He wrote, "Let alpha equals kappa divided by rho. Alpha equals kappa, rho." Then rewrite the perturbation term phi, as phi equals alpha psi, plus epsilon theta, phi equals p alpha psi, plus var epsilon, theta. Beneath that, he sketched vector fields, mapped coordinate transformation, and then underlined the next step, symmetry, in dual basis. A whisper rippled through the hall. Even seasoned mathematicians shifted to peer over notebooks. James explained in a low, clear voice. This substitution isolates terms in a non-Euclidean coupling by transferring them to a secondary manifold where the torsion becomes a linear operator. In doing so, what looked like an intractable nonlinear coupling becomes decomposable. Professor William tightened his jaw. He approached the board, eyes scanning James's work. In the audience, someone recorded on a phone. Students leaned forward. James continued. Observe here. The cross term involving the Laplace-Beltrami operator can be expressed as a sum of eigenfunctions in an orthonormal basis of the induced metric. We can thus factor out the problematic term and reduce dimensionality. He underlined that step with a fine, confident marker line. The room felt like it floated. Noise had dropped below perception. Even the air between numbers stiffened. He paused, looked into the crowd, then returned to the board. He circled a cluster of variables and wrote, symmetry emerges when theta 0, theta, right arrow 0, under limit as boundary curvature tends to 0. Slow applause erupted from one side. Others sat motionless. William stood face to face with James. Then he nodded slightly. The nod was small, but it crackled like thunder. James's voice softened. The insight is that boundary behavior isn't suppressing the coupling. It's hiding within the projection. When we lift the projection, the symmetry reveals itself. He connected dots, invisible lines in math, until the original monster equation looked folded out, simplified, reshaped. When he capped the marker, he leaned back, breath heavy. He had drawn more than a path forward. He had built a bridge. The hall sat in stunned silence. A professor's hands trembled over her notes. A student gasped and covered his mouth. Mrs. Nora exhaled. Dean Phillips sat upright, his brow taut. Professor Williams stepped to the board and placed his finger on a cluster of terms James had isolated. He traced them. Then he stepped back, jaw slack. He looked at James not as a child, but as a peer, grudgingly respectful. This is not how I would have done it, Williams said. His voice was low, taut. But it is valid. James's heart pounded. He looked to the board, to William, to the audience. The applause broke soft, then louder. Some stood, some shook their heads. But then, immediately, the guard from before stood again at the doorway, stepping in. He held out James's notebook. The room stilled mid-applause. Amid the hush, William said, "Bring it here." The guard walked forward. The notebook was placed on a small table near the board. Its pages fanned open. The envelope was cracked. James's heart turned inside him. The hidden margin note, the handwriting not his own, had fallen earlier. Now it lay exposed between math and admiration. William's eyes flicked to the open page. His face shifted shock, anger, confusion. Dean Phillips signaled. The assistant rushed up to gather the pages. But the words were already visible to all. They read, "You weren't supposed to show this yet." A professor gasped. A whisper snapped. "What is that?" William's voice cut through the tension. "Close the envelope." Everyone stepped back. James stepped away from the board, his knees shaking, back screaming. Mrs. Nora slipped beside him. The air felt as though it fractured. The equation on the board was no longer the only question. All eyes turned to William and to the hidden margin note that threatened everything. Then William walked to the table, flipped open another page in the envelope, revealing not James's writing, but someone else's annotations. Corrections, alternate paths, instructions. The room froze, and the name above those annotations was unmistakable. Richard William. He had annotated his own problem. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, after William announced he'd annotated the problem himself. James backed away from the board, his heart hammering, body trembling, back protesting with every inch of stillness. The auditorium felt too small now, full of eyes, full of weight. William advanced slowly toward the table, where the notebook lay open. The annotations in someone else's hand, his own name scrawled as the author shivered in the light. The revelation felt like a breach. Every participant sensed that what they'd witnessed was more than a mathematical moment. William's voice cut through the quiet. These annotations, they correspond precisely with the steps Mr. Smith just executed. Someone has laid his path in advance. Gasps circled. Students shifted in their seats. Professors stared. The assistant tried to close the envelope, but hesitated. The pages fluttered. The annotation line called out, "Symmetry emerges under torsion mapping, see step 11. Dean Phillips stood. "Professor, please." His voice carried calm control, though tension curled under it. "We must examine all this together." William flicked his gaze at James, whose knees quivered. Mr. Smith, did someone help you? His tone carried accusation, dread, curiosity all mixing into the same harsh note. James swallowed. His throat felt raw. No one, he said, voice trembling. No one touched this notebook except me. A professor in the front row, white-haired and serious, stood. He cleared his throat. If I may. His voice carried authority. I have compared Mr. Smith's steps to the original published methods. What he's done is not only correct but more direct, fewer steps, more elegant transitions, a clarity in mapping that I have not seen even in advanced dissertations. A ripple of disbelief passed through the room. William's lips pressed together. James felt a surge of fear. Validation or collapse? The senior professor continued. In fact, his approach simplifies one transformation from 14 steps down to 6. That is remarkable. It is valid. A beat. Then, as though released, the room erupted in applause. It spread hesitant at first, then warmer, louder, unrestrained. Students stood. Professors leapt to their feet. Cameras clicked. Hands clapped. James swallowed. He felt himself shake. His vision flickered. He heard the sound, distant and muffled applause, approval, wonder, a tidal wave of affirmation. Mrs. Norris slipped beside him, dipping her head, eyes wet. Dean Phillips began clapping, nodding, signaling support. Even some faculty at Harvard rose to their feet. William remained still, face unmoving, eyes locked on James. For a moment, it felt like time froze around them. James's knees threatened collapse. His hand tingled. Sweat traced along his brow. His lungs burned. He wanted to speak, to cry, to collapse. But he stayed upright. The senior professor seemed to sense the fragility. He gestured. Let's examine this publicly, line by line. William nodded slowly, stiffly. He motioned to the board. The assistants moved in, handing markers and rearranging slides. James felt his body hum with pressure. He stood in the center, a solitary figure framed by whiteboards and applauding ruin. Then William cleared his throat, voice changed colder. We will begin with Mr. Smith's substitution of the perturbation term. Mr. Smith? James swallowed. He stepped forward with unsteady feet. He motioned to the board. He spoke, quiet but audible. The substitution moves the torsion coupling into the dual manifold, thereby linearizing the coefficient under the induced metric. This reduces cross terms that otherwise resist orthogonalization. He followed each step he had written. The senior professor nodded, murmured agreement, pointed out small refinements. William watched, impassive. As James explained, clarity bloomed across the faces of listeners. The path he traced, though unconventional, made sense. The resonance between variables, the way hidden symmetries opened, the elegance of cancellation. A camera flashed. A student gasped. Another professor scribbled, but then William raised his hand, cutting James mid-sentence. One moment. James froze. The hush crashed. William walked to the side table, edged near the notebook. He regarded the margins again. He turned to James. You are right in your logic, he said. But those margin notes, they align too closely to your work. Someone might have coached you, heard your thought pattern, guided you covertly. The coldness in his voice was a blade. The audience stilled. Whispers flickered. James's breath caught. No one did, he repeated, quieter than before. You must excuse my suspicion, William continued. I am an academic skeptical of miracles. His gaze flicked at the envelope. Dean Phillips stood strongly. Or you are skeptical of what you did not expect. William's jaw tensed. The notebook lay between them like a contested relic. James felt something crack inside him, that fragile barrier between ambition and accusation. Then, unexpectedly, the senior professor stepped between them. He pointed to the board. Whether or not the margin note corresponds, the mathematics stands on its own. Let us judge the work, not the rumor. The room tensed again. William closed his eyes momentarily, then opened them. He nodded curtly. William turned to a teaching assistant. Is the room being recorded? The assistant nodded. Good. William's voice reasserted control. Then we proceed with the analysis. Let all see clearly. James exhaled. He leaned against the board, collecting himself, arms shaky. He felt the roar of applause still echoing. He felt his back burn, every inch of him alive and vulnerable. As the panel resumed, scanning his derivations, validating simplifications, tracing transformations, pointing out minute corrections, the balance tipped finally in his favor. Multiple professors lined up, nodding. The senior professor who had spoken earlier physically kissed his fingers to his lips in admiration. William's face remained impassive, but his eyes flicked. Outside, a sudden murmur spread through the hallways. In the verge of full recognition, something uneasy blossomed. James, half dazed, looked at Mrs. Nora. She squeezed his hand. His body trembled, not just from relief but from the precariousness of the moment. It felt as though they had scaled a peak, but no one had told them whether the ground beneath would hold. Then, as the panel prepared to wrap up the validation, the original envelope creaked. The assistant, unaware of the gravity inside, flipped one more page, revealing a handwritten line in a third handwriting. Faint but present. You betrayed him. But he earned it. When the words registered, a gasp echoed. Eyes darted. A professor backed away. William's face twisted. The notebook trembled. James froze. The room locked. The margin line glowed in the soft light. Suddenly, William stepped forward, voice low and resonant. Someone here meant to sabotage this moment. And all eyes turned, not just on James, but on every face in the room. Who had betrayed whom and why? The auditorium had shifted. What had begun as a mathematical display was now a stage for deeper truths. William stood rigidly beside the open notebook, mouth tight, eyes darting across faces. His reputation felt exposed not just by James's solution, but by that margin note. You betrayed him, but he earned it. James sat quietly a few steps back, trembling, sweat beading on his brow. The applause had waned. What remained was a silence that felt heavier than judgment. Professors exchanged glances, uncertainty humming in the room. William cleared his throat. His voice came low, measured. I never imagined this. He paused, as though recalibrating speech. This anomaly. To see my own problem annotated in someone else's handwriting, and then to witness its execution with such clarity. He turned toward the notebook table, gestured to the pages. If these annotations guided Mr. Smith's path, then I owe him more than scrutiny. I owe him apology. The room gasped. Dean Phillips's eyes widened. Mrs. Nora stood, uncertain whether to relax or brace. James's chest tightened. Could this moment be real? William took a breath. My assumptions about who belongs in mathematics, who can reach its heights, were built on comfort, tradition, and legacy told by people who looked very much like me. I believed that excellence was predictable, traceable, gate-kept. I believed that talent needed cultivation from within, accepted institutions, not spontaneous, raw brilliance arriving from unexpected places. He shook his head. But today, seeing Mr. Smith's work, the annotations, the context, I was confronted with the limits of my worldview. A professor near the front stood. Then you recognize that you misjudged him. William's voice cracked slightly. I misjudged the boy. I misjudged the gift. And I fear I've misled many by insisting that only certain paths were valid. He turned, carefully, to James. You didn't need those annotations to make the mathematics your own. You stole the margin words, transformed them, made them yours. That is rare courage. James's heart thundered. He looked at his mother, then Mrs. Nora, then the professors leaning forward. At that moment, the auditorium doors swung open. Amara Johnson entered, breathless, in her hospital scrubs covered by a pressed coat. The crowd shifted. All eyes turned. She walked steadily down the aisle, her face composed but fierce. She reached center stage, stood before William and James, and paused. The silence stretched. My son was struck in 4th grade, she said, her voice firm but quiet, for correcting a teacher's math. The teacher's name was Miss Winters. The bruises across his back were documented. I submitted medical records. I asked for accountability at that time. I asked for change. What I got instead was a warning for her and silence for him. She inhaled, stealing her voice. He's been carrying that injury, that injustice, ever since. It shaped his learning. It shaped his need to stand. You asked why he stood. I tell you, because sitting was a punishment he was forced to endure by those who refused to see him. There was a hush so deep, even the air seemed to hold breath. William's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered, guilt and defense clashing. Amara turned to face him. You, Professor William, dismissed that boy in your logic before you even knew his logic. But he proved you wrong today. She lifted her chin. Acknowledgement is a start, but he deserves more. He deserves validation, opportunity, protection, not condescension, not excuses. A ripple spread. Some faculty shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at William. Some looked at James with renewed reverence. William swallowed, visibly. His defense faltered. He ran a hand through his hair. He turned to the audience, voice trembling. I stand corrected, and I stand in need of understanding. He turned to James. Mr. Smith, you have forced me, and perhaps this institution, to confront truths I have long ignored. I would like to speak with you, deeply, about what happens next. Dean Phillips stepped forward. You'll have it publicly and privately. At that moment, the teaching assistant approached, hands shaking slightly. He laid another sheet from the envelope on the table. It had more margin notes, a hidden dedication. For Richard, to test faith. William's face paled. Amara's voice was quiet but firm. What did you mean by that? William's lips parted, as though caught between shame and explanation. James watched him. The weight of betrayal and mastery intertwined in the same room. In that charged space, the professor confronted the limits of his authority. But before any answer could come, the senior professor rose from his seat. He raised his voice to the chamber. Let this not be about redemption only, he said. Let it be about dismantling barriers. Let this moment push us to new standards. Not the ones. We inherited, the ones we create. The applause broke anew, slower, firmer, with a sense of movement. William swallowed, nodded. Amara exhaled. James's legs trembled. Mrs. Nora's eyes glistened. Yet something in that moment remained unspoken. The margin note's hidden dedication, the betrayal intimated, the collision of assumptions, they were more than symbolic hazards. William's worldview was cracking, but how far would he let it fracture? As everyone turned toward the pages again, one last sheet fell from within the notebook face down, hidden until now. It fluttered open, revealing a cryptic formula and a signature. Eleanor Phillips. All eyes snapped to Dean Phillips, and the realization hung in the air. Had the dean been part of the margin conspiracy all along? The moment the video hit social media, it felt like an explosion. Clips of James's steps at the whiteboard, his firm voice explaining boundary substitutions, the judge-like pause when the guard walked in, all of it went viral within hours. Thousands of shares, retweets, screenshots. The margin note with, "You weren't supposed to show this yet," splashed across headlines. At Harvard's Department of Mathematics, alarms blared in huddled offices, emails pinged inboxes, faculty slack-jawed in meeting rooms. The dean's office was besieged by messages from alumni, press, and discontented mathematicians. In one such room, Dean Phillips stared at a dashboard showing video stats. 1.2 million views, trending in 3 countries, reposted by major outlets. He tapped his lip. William paced behind him, every step echoing in the marble hall. "You see this?" William said, voice tight. "Millions now know what we witnessed today." Phillips nodded. Not just witnessed, questioned. They're demanding accountability, transparency, change. The public doesn't want tokenism. They want structure reformed. William exhaled sharply. Then we must answer. And lead. Back home, Amara sat in the living room, her phone buzzing with messages from local journalists, educational nonprofits, and mathematicians she had never met. Her inbox overflowed. James sat on the couch beside her, notebook open but untouched. He watched the notifications roll in. Black boy solves Harvard problem. Harvard stunned by 10-year-old. Institution challenged by its own assumptions. He swallowed. His heart pounded. "Mom," he said softly, "do they really understand what any of this means?" She reached over and took his hand. "Some do. Many don't yet. But today the world sees you, and they'll have to reckon with that." He nodded. The weight of visibility pressed his shoulders down. At Harvard, the administration convened a high-level task force. The president's office called a meeting. Dean Phillips delivered the case. A true movement could be born from this moment. The research office drafted proposals. External foundations expressed interest. Within days, Harvard announced the James Smith Initiative for Mathematical Excellence, a new program designed to identify, nurture, and fund gifted math minds from underrepresented communities. Offices would be created, scholarships allocated, outreach into public schools, grants for mentoring and summer programs. The announcement sent a ripple across academic circles. Some criticized the timing was at optics. Others praised it a long overdue step. In the midst of it all, Richard Williams stepped down as department chair. The press release framed it as a sacrifice for the initiative, to lead with humility and vision. Yet many whispered, He stepped down because the foundation of his authority had cracked. In the first meeting of the new initiative, William took a seat facing students and colleagues, now as director, not gatekeeper. He towered at the lectern, his voice low, more human than the authoritarians had ever heard. He began, "I now confront what I once dismissed. Talent does not follow pedigree. Genius does not wear institutional robes. This program exists not to elevate a few, but to shift the ground beneath us all." He gestured toward James, sitting front and center. He raised his hand when no one else would. "Today, I step aside not because I have nothing left to assert, but because I have much to learn." The room cracked open applause, soft then rising. Tears. Nods. James rose, approached William, and they stood side by side. The audience held its breath. An invited student asked, "Professor, what accountability does the initiative have to remain honest, transparent, fair?" William looked at him. "Exactly that. We will publish reports. We will build governance with representation, not dictate from above. This is a living experiment." Dean Phillips closed the meeting, but before he did, he added something quiet but weighty. "This is just the beginning." Outside Harvard, the news spread beyond academic circles. Educational blogs, social justice networks, Black STEM collectives amplified the story. Parents in underserved districts watched the video. Students who doubted themselves saw what possibility looked like. A notable philanthropist reached out with initial funding. Foundations invited Amara and Mrs. Nora as advisory voices. Local news stations broadcast James solving the impossible problem. Headlines recognized not the spectacle of a child in a Harvard lecture hall, but the systemic barrier he exposed. One evening, James walked with Mrs. Nora through Harvard Yard. The dusk light cast long shadows. The new initiative's banner hung across a building nearby. James Smith Initiative for Mathematical Excellence. A group of younger students, visiting from a public middle school, spotted him, their eyes lit. One girl held out her phone timidly. "Are you James?" she asked. "I watched your video. It changed how I see math." James smiled, throat tight. He nodded. The girl's friend asked for an autograph. He hesitated, then signed his name in the margin of a napkin. Mrs. Nora watched him, pride and worry mingling. The program had launched, but the journey was far from over. But behind closed doors, not everyone was pleased. In a dimly lit office, a senior Harvard professor, once a rival to William, pressed his fingers to his lips as he stared at the margin annotations and the leadership memo with Eleanor Phillips's name. He frowned deeply. He dialed a number. "Yes, it's me. We have a public shift, but some of us don't want the hidden truths dragged into daylight." On the other end, someone said quietly, "Or maybe we want their truths to destabilize the foundations." Elsewhere, a leaked email from a department committee circulated among faculty. "We must preserve standards. Let initiative be controlled. Let brilliance shake walls, but not our towers." Rumors whispered that James's spotlight might be co-opted, that the initiative might be watered down, that old networks might sabotage or redirect the movement to protect status. In the inaugural event for the initiative, flags waved, speeches made. Staff welcomed program scholars from diverse districts. James stood at the front with Amara, Mrs. Nora, Dean Phillips, and William. Cameras rolled, flashbulbs popped, but in the back, among the audience, a lone graduate student sat, quiet, notebook, open watching. He scribbled something. "Not all allies are innocent." James looked out at the faces. The journey that began with a child raising his hand had grown into something bigger, more fragile, more full of possibility. As the group posed for photos, a loud ping echoed from James's phone. He looked down. A new message had arrived. One line. "We never forgot the margin. Neither should you." He looked across the crowd at Dean Phillips and felt the weight of unfinished secrets shifting beneath them all. 6 months later, Harvard's Maxwell Hall felt both familiar and transformed. The whiteboards had fresh layers of ink. The rows of seats held not only professors and doctoral candidates, but a new chorus of voices, bright, diverse, relentless. Children from districts that once would never receive a nod were now standing at the front, notebooks in hand. James stood at the lectern, the same lectern where he once wrote in fear, now confident. Behind him, a projection glowed. James Smith Initiative for Mathematical Excellence Lecture Series, Session 1. In the front rows sat students of every background: Black, Latinx, Indigenous, immigrant children whose names Harvard had only recently learned to hold in regard. Some of them stood or sat on cushions or athletic stools for whom constrained seating would be a barrier, not a given. Harvard had, in these months, begun to rewire its expectations. Mrs. Nora and Amara sat in the front row, proud and cautious. Dean Phillips stood at the side, scanning faces. Professor William, now no longer chair but director of the initiative, sat among colleagues, observing. James cleared his throat. "Welcome, everyone, to our first session," he began, voice steady. The air felt charged. He paused, then added, "Before we dive into the problem set, I want to tell you a story about standing." He recounted that first moment in Maxwell Hall, when no one expected him to belong, when he raised his hand, and when his body forced him to stand because it could not sit. He told them about the bruises, the whispers, the silent disbelief. He told them of Miss Winters, the principal's dismissal, the margin notes, the betrayal, the validation, and the movement that was born. He looked over the sea of faces, each child with their own story, and said, "It's your turn to raise your hand." He introduced a new problem, one chosen from among proposals submitted by the program's students, one that required creative thinking rather than canonical rote methods. Step by step, James guided them through reinterpretations, encouraging multiple pathways. "No single method owns the solution," he told them. "Let your perspective be your tool." Hands shot up, small voices, large voices. Students debated the mapping, suggested substitutions, questioned assumptions. The room echoed with mathematical dialogue, not timid whispers, but confident exploration. The questions themselves became as important as the answers. At one point, a girl named Amira, a student from a rural school, hesitated, then asked, "What if we invert the manifold mapping and allow torsion feedback? Would that collapse or generalize the coupling?" Silence. Then multiple nods. James beamed. William leaned forward. Philip scribbled notes. The process had inverted. The students were teaching. James was guiding. And Harvard was listening. Afterward, in the debrief, James turned to William with a calm he had never had that first day. He asked, "Do you regret that I raised my hand that day?" William paused, looked at him. There was a long beat. The question hung between them like a weight. Then William's face softened, and he walked forward, placed a hand gently on James's shoulder. "Quite the opposite," he said. The crowd murmured. Some cheered. A few, with tears. James exhaled. The years of struggle, the bruised body, the margin betrayal, all seemed to converge into this moment. But as he looked at the children now standing, pushing boundaries, asking questions, he realized the story was far from over. He turned to the audience. If one hand raised changed all of this, how many hands remain unseen? How many voices unheard? The room sat quietly. Then whispers turned to nods. Then to dozens of raised hands. And behind him, the projection flickered. What voices will you raise today? No one should have to fight this hard just to be seen. If you've ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed because of who you are, you already know this pain. What voices are we still ignoring? Comment below whose hand will you raise next. If this story moved you, share it, so more people see what brilliance looks like when it's finally allowed to speak, and subscribe, so that no voice ever goes unheard again.